So I've got a really nice job very briefly to introduce each of our panel members. I'll do that one by one, and we will ask each of them to speak for just 3 minutes on what they see as, in the main, the barriers. They can stray into solution just a tiny little bit, but this is about the barriers, what they see as the barriers to the effective science policy exchange. So first of all, on my immediate right is Professor Georgina Mace, who is a Fellow of the Royal Society and, of course, is on the Natural Capital Committee and is the Professor of Biodiversity and Ecosystems at UCL. Georgina. Yeah, press that on the phone. There you go.
Okay. Well,
you can leave it on.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to Andy for the introduction and Ian for a great opening speech. I should say actually at the outset that although I am a member of the Natural Capital Committee and a member of NOAC Council, I'm speaking now in a personal capacity, not representing either of those bodies. So yes, addressing this question, what needs to work better in the science policy interface? So because I'm an unreformed evolutionary ecologist, I can only think about this question by thinking first about what the functions are that the science policy interface needs to accomplish. So this is actually thinking again about what both Bill and Ian Boyd have said, but I'm going to take a slightly different emphasis on it. So I think there are 3 different kinds of roles that interface needs to deliver on. One of them is providing advice, guidance, and evidence to support better policy development and implementation. So we've talked quite a lot about this, and Bill had some nice examples of it. Tree creeper nest boxes come in there, species and habitat conservation. This is just about doing policy better using scientific evidence. The second kind of function is a different one, and it's being at the forefront of new science, leading the development of new understanding, new tools and methods, innovative ways of doing business. Now, this is definitely not directed science. It's not in the box that you might call applied, and it's really important it's not directed because many of the best solutions come out of people tackling problems that were different to the one they ended up answering. And this is how science progresses, and the big changes in both policy and implementation and indeed new tools and techniques will come out of funding that basic science. So some examples here, recognizing the importance of ocean acidification, spotting the Asian vulture declines in the 1990s, some of the new technologies around negative emission technologies in using landscapes, new biocontrol, gene drives, these sort of things. These are new ways of thinking about problems, and new solutions. That's a second area. The third one is about challenging and holding to account policymakers and government. And I think it's different from those first two. And it means the scientific community, again, has to be a bit apart from the policy community. And we've seen plenty of examples of this. Badger culling might be one. Neonicotinoids is one. These are cases where the scientific community is acting as an independent arbiter, challenging government, moving the process on. So I see those as 3 different things, and being able to achieve all of those requires the right suite of organizations and funding streams to support them. So we have this set of bodies, government departments, government agencies, the public research laboratories, the NGOs, the academic researchers, and we have a set of funding streams that are more or less directed. And I'm just going to highlight 2 things that I think are a problem, sorry, I will finish in a second, in this space. So if you get that set of organizations and their funding right, the system works. It is a system. It's not a single tool that you use to do the science policy interface. And if you start distorting that system without thinking about some of the implications, it has rather unfortunate consequences. And there are 2 that I'll just highlight now, maybe to stimulate discussion. So one of them at the moment is about the very strong incentives for academic researchers to publish high-impact finding in high-profile journals. And that's driving science in this policy space in a rather bizarre way towards perhaps overselling the bit of science. The journals love to oversell an article. It's extremely unlikely that one paper is going to alter a piece of policy, and yet quite often it's presented that way. And I blame the incentives and I blame the journals. A second one is recent changes in funding streams that have come out of the Comprehensive Spending Review last year, so it's really great that the science budget was protected, but many other bits of that ecosystem of science policy funding have been really badly hit within government departments, agencies, the public research labs and so on. And I think if you have that unbalance in the funding, you also end up with an unbalance in the system. And particularly, it's very difficult for the academic community to create these good synergistic relationships with the policy community that Ian was talking about in his presentation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Georgina. I'm now going to introduce Des Thompson, who's with Scottish Natural Heritage and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's the Principal Advisor for Biodiversity. Des.
Thanks very much, and many congratulations for this wonderful building, actually. It's fantastic to be here. I canvassed some views before coming down here. I went to some civil servants, agency staff, NGOs, variety of people to say, we're here to discuss sort of problems, barriers to the process we're dealing with at the moment. And I got one very interesting response from a senior Mandarin. He said, we're continually reacting to events and fairly short-term priorities. The research programme, the Scottish Government research programme, is full of very worthy stuff, but moves at a glacial pace. Well, glacial pace might be, a compliment in some regards. And ministers need stuff next week, and they need the headlines. That's what matters to them. And it got me thinking about the conversation, and Ian touched on this in his presentation, the conversation. Are we clear as ecologists about who's asking the questions? What's being asked for? Is it a view? Is it an opinion? And in my own view, opinions can be very dangerous. Are we being asked for the evidence? Or are we being asked for a judgment? The judgment is very difficult. And in all of this, we have to develop trust, a word that both Ian and Georgina have used in developing that relationship. And part of this is anticipating the questions, being clear about the questions, having a view to horizon scanning, great work that Bill and others have been developing, and having a feel for the questions that are coming along and the sorts of answers we need. And then you come to the answers themselves, the advice you're having to give. Cut to the chase. Stick to the headlines. Don't get immersed in the chaff in the background. Ministers and senior officials are not interested in that. And critically, don't answer the question you want to pose. Answer the question that's being asked of you. In giving ecological advice, it's incredibly important to understand the drivers of change. Have a grasp of what we mean by success and failure. Have a grasp of what we need to influence in terms of policy, practices, interventions, etc. And when you're drawing on the evidence, think about the importance of what we call co-produced evidence. Evidence produced by a broad range of stakeholders. The narrative evidence, as some people refer to it. And remember, as ecologists, we can only influence the non-ecological agenda if we embrace the other sectors, the health, the tourism, the education, the transport, the industry sectors. My final bit of advice, which was given to me once by our chief executive, probably for a very good reason, he said, just because you think you're right, it doesn't mean you are right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Des. And we've obviously strayed into a bit of solutions there, so I'm going to be really hard with Gemma and focus Gemma Harper, who's already been introduced by Ian, onto obstacles. And just so that everybody on the panel doesn't need to say it, Obviously, those in the panel who are in the public sector, much of what they say this afternoon will be their personal views rather than speaking on behalf of their organisation, particularly as we approach local elections and the referendum. Gemma.
Thank you, Andy. Could you put your hand up if you consider yourself a social scientist? Oh, I'm pleasantly surprised. Well, we'll work on that. I'm pleasantly surprised. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll do my best in 3 minutes. That helps me a lot. I want to start by saying I think we should build on and celebrate success. We have a world envious network of chief scientific advisors and science advisory councils in government, as well as hundreds of evidence specialists within Whitehall. So my first recommendation to you is, if you don't know those people and those groups, please get to know them. They are the critical friends for policymakers and for you. And we also work as hard as we possibly can to build relationships with the research councils, the learned academies and academia through fellowships. And my own social science expert panel that I built with DEC is a really good example of that. But on to a bit more of the problems. The problem for me is twofold. It's about definition and it's about hierarchy. When you become a policymaker, go to the dark side as I have, you get presented with a Venn diagram, and everything in government can be summarized in a Venn diagram, and we're always aiming for that sweet spot in the middle. And in this Venn diagram, there's evidence, there's politics, and there's deliverability. And that's really the first part of the problem, because evidence is put to this side, as if there isn't a social science about deliverability, as if there isn't a social and political science, and indeed arts and humanities around politics. So I think we need, and my recommendation is, a very broad, inclusive and expansive definition of evidence without crossing the red lines into quality and standards and so on. I think the second point really is about hierarchy, and if you've had any experience of evidence in government, there really is a quite clear hierarchy of different types of evidence, and I characterize it, but really it starts with the natural scientists. So there's a real world, and natural scientists very helpfully describe it. Then somebody in government worries about the money, so you bring in the economists and you make a case to Treasury, and then somebody realizes that there's this thing called the public, and how on earth are they going to respond to this? So let's bring in the social scientists. And that very linear process is actually quite damaging. What we need is to deconstruct that hierarchy, is to have a process by which different evidence specialists get together with the policymakers, with our legal colleagues, with our communication colleagues, and help define the problem and move away from that very linear approach. So I'm asking really, I suppose, for diversity, both diversity of thinking about this audience, and it's great that there are social scientists, natural scientists here too, and also giving real thought to the strength there is in diversity of different disciplines, different views, different approaches to the issues that we're trying to address. But I'd also finish by making an exception to my own rule that I think proves the rule, and to encourage you to inhabit what I believe to be one of the sort of unsung heroes of disciplines, which is anthropology. Become anthropologists over the next 3 days. Study the language, the rituals, the symbols that define each of these disciplines. Deconstruct them, break them down, and then reconstruct them so that we make conservation, not scientific discipline, the goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'd now like to introduce Professor Susan Owens, who's in geography here in the University of Cambridge. Susan was part of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and when I heard her speak recently, the travel time from the Royal Commission to a policy being accepted by government varied from 25 minutes to 7 years. So she certainly knows what she's talking about. And some of you may have seen her recent book that's just been published, Knowledge, Policy and Expertise. Susan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am going to try to focus on obstacles and problems. And I think the first problem that I'd like to comment on is the set of unrealistic expectations of science policy interactions in a functioning democracy. And indeed, I think it's quite interesting that we haven't really even asked what should that relationship look like in a well-functioning democracy. And that might be something that people like to consider over the next few days as the ideas of the conference unfold. So one of the unrealistic expectations is that somehow science is a sphere over here and politics and policy making are a separate sphere over here, and scientists produce findings, evidence, policymakers are waiting with open arms to receive them and incorporate them into their policies. It's the so-called linear rational fallacy, and the most surprising thing about it is that in spite of an extended and really very sophisticated critique, it keeps bouncing back. You can't drive a stake through the heart of this linear rational fallacy. So that's one problem. The other is what I'd call the communication fallacy. If science doesn't have an impact or doesn't have an obvious impact on policy, then it must be a problem of communication. So either the scientists aren't putting things in a way that policymakers can understand, or the policymakers aren't hearing what the scientists say, or if they're hearing it, they're not understanding it. So then we get the kind of Englishman abroad version of the science policy problem. If they don't do what you think they should do, you speak more slowly and very loudly and hope that they might then take it up. In practice, and certainly my own really very extended research and membership of the Royal Commission, suggests that one of the most important reasons for what sometimes looks like a disjuncture between science and policy making is that in functioning democracies there are limited degrees of freedom in the political arena. So actually most politicians do evidence-based policy all the time. It's just that the evidence might be telling them very clearly, if you do that, we won't vote for you when it's an election. So I think those fallacies are a big problem, and really what they point to is the need for much more sophisticated understandings of the scientific process, of the political process, and of the very, very complicated sets of interactions between the two. So because the political environment matters, what we tend to find is a spectrum of different kinds of effect and influence from science into politics and policy making. At one end are the direct hits, the really visible short-term impacts, and they do happen sometimes, and they tend to happen when the scientific advice resonates with the political temper of the times. And then you have a very good chance of being heard. You move along and you find what I've called dormant seeds. Nothing happens straight away, but gradually, after a period of time, the political ground becomes more fertile, and even in the absence of any new evidence or any new facts, the policy gradually takes up those scientific findings. And even further along the spectrum, you have a very diffuse form of influence of science where knowledge is very gradually absorbed, some analysts say creeps, into politics and policy making. And this happens, as it were, in tandem with the evolution of the science and the evolution of the policy frame. And then it's really hard to track the influence of any particular bit of scientific advice. What's interesting about those latter processes is that they are very slow, and they sometimes operate on decadal timescales. 7 years would actually be quite quick in the longest period for the Royal Commission's advice to have influence and still be recognisable, as it were, to the Royal Commission was 25 years. So you know, it doesn't necessarily happen quickly. So the message out of all of that, and another set of problems, is that knowledge does matter. You can't look back over 5 decades of environmental policy and pretend for a single second that the science didn't matter. Of course it did. However, these are my problems for consideration. There's too much impatience. We often expect science to produce findings that influence policy straight away. Fortunately, that doesn't happen. I don't want to live in a technocracy. I actually quite like living in a democracy, imperfect as that system is. Secondly, when science doesn't apparently influence policy quickly, it's far too easy to be cynical and say those policymakers, they're just going to do what they want to do. It doesn't matter what scientists say, and that's wrong as well. Thirdly, we should never expect scientific trump cards to settle enduring controversies. Those controversies, as others have already said, involve values. They are fundamentally ethical and political. Waiting for the facts is a favourite way of kicking issues into the long grass, but it's never going to settle the controversy. Penultimately, and in some contradiction to what others have said, too blind an insistence on the separation of science and politics seems to me actually to be an impediment to constructive encounters between these two hugely important human endeavours. In the sorts of areas that many ecologists work, deep uncertainties, high stakes, profound divergence of value judgments means that in practice, and as the political scientist Sheila Jasanoff has argued, the science and the politics are produced together. And it seems to me recognising that reality would be very helpful and productive. And finally, I think there's too much emphasis on individual responsibilities, on scientists already under goodness knows what pressure from REF and all sorts of things to package their results for policymakers. It isn't going to happen most of the time. On policymakers, to be tracking scientific development all the time, that's not going to happen either. I think there's not enough emphasis on so-called boundary spaces and skilled intermediaries in this kind of interactive space, some of which are the advisory bodies that Ian has already mentioned, and I think that is a success story. I agree with Gemma on that, and it's an area in which a great deal more effort could fruitfully be put. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. And finally, as Ian said, we need more scientists in politics. And Andrew Miller, who was until recently the Labour MP for Ellesmere Port, chaired the Science and Technology Committee for 5 years until 2015. Andrew.
Thank you. I too start questioning what the relationship should look like in a functioning democracy, and I conclude that it isn't about, and this is where the only point I disagree with Ian, it isn't just about getting more MPs who are scientists. I think in a functioning democracy we need to be represented by a good cross-section of society, and the three previous parliaments, I haven't looked at the data in this one, about 10% of the House had at some stage in their career worked in a STEM discipline. And I think that's not bad when if you ask that same question out in the street. Bill, in his introduction, talked about amateurism in this link between science and policy. And it's very easy to blame the policy makers for that. I don't. I think, and Georgina touched on this in her contribution, it is about how we engage with young scientists as they come through their training and how we prepare them for the world within which they're going to work. I'm a patron of a charity active in it called Newton's Apple, which goes round universities engaging with young groups of scientists, helping them with the support of senior civil servants, of learned societies, and a tiny little bit, not enough from the private sector, helping them to understand how policy is made and how they can influence that policy-making process. To my mind, that ought to be part of the impact agenda. If you look at the work that Chris Tyler from Post has published, there is some thinking along that lines going on within Parliament that hopefully we can develop. Georgina talked about systems. The ecosystem that we need has to involve that education. It has to involve engagement, which I'll come back to in a moment, and it has to take into account the environment within which you are giving advice or talking to policymakers, because nothing in this life is as black and white as some people would like it to be. Interesting debates going on in my area, where I live, about the exploitation of shale gas, for example. And that is not a black and white issue, as some people would like it to be perceived as. Ian said we can all be advisors, and that, to my mind, is the key. And the challenge to you is how many of you, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up now, but how many of you have engaged with your Member of Parliament, your councillor, to help them understand the importance of the work that you are doing to help them understand the relevance of science going on in their constituencies. And that's the kind of approach that we need to develop. And yes, it is about evidence-informed policy, because not all policy is simply developed by plucking the science out and saying that is therefore what we do. A very good example of this would be a couple of years ago, this is a Labour MP saying this about the current Home Secretary, an ex-Labour MP. Theresa May published a letter in response to some advice she received from the Advisory Committee on Misuse of Drugs. It was about the substance cat. Now, she handled that in an exemplary way. She didn't chuck out the scientific advice. She thanked the Advisory Committee for their work, but in parallel said, and for these stated reasons, one relating to foreign policy development and one related to evidence around domestic violence in communities where it's used extensively, came from the police, she was minded to come to a different conclusion. And it's that kind of factor that one has to realise that comes into play in the policy-making process. And finally, yes, evidence does 5 years, that's ever so short. 7 years. I had a phone call on the way down from the Wall Street Journal asking me about a paper that I'd written, my select committee had written, in 2011, because apparently it's sort of going to become government policy. This was on, remember this tonight, it's about consumption of alcohol. But I think that's a good point to finish.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Okay, so you've heard a wide range of ideas from our panel. Now it's your turn in the audience. We've got about 25 minutes to take your questions. I'll take one question, refer to one or two members of the panel, but then if you've got points around that question, put your hands up and I'll come to you for comments. But we need questions in the first instance. Who's going to be first? The lady over here.
Hi there, my name is Nikki Rust from San Diego Zoo, and I'm a social scientist. I was one of the only people to put my hand up. This is actually specifically to Gemma, but if anyone else has an answer, I'd love to hear from them. Why is it you think that we're so thin on the ground?
Gemma.
In some areas we are, in some areas we aren't. So in UK government, in big social policy departments, we're not. In departments that deal with more environmental, so the sort of energy, environment, water, ecosystem, that kind of nexus, where there's a tradition of a lot more natural science, I think it's emerging. So it's the history of the topic, really. And I also think there's something around for government, understanding who's out there in the academic world, that on social science issues, a lot of it's transferable. So you don't need to be a deep, deep specialist into this very specific thing for decades in order to understand it. Actually, you're dealing with social structures, economic structures that have different incentives and different disincentives, but you can apply a lot of that learning to different fields if you're interested in understanding what motivates and constrains people, for example, in relation to conservation goals. So I think it's a matter of sort of history and legacy around some of these big topics that fundamentally have a natural science basis. But I think the challenge is both for government and for academia to find those points of connection, and I think they are several.
Anybody else on this social science question? The gentleman here and the lady at the back, was that the same? No, thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Clive Mitchell from Scottish Natural Heritage. I'm a geologist, so I have no place here at all. But building on that, the last point in particular, one of the things that interests me is the relationship between what you might call matters of fact, which you might think of as evidence, and matters of concern, and which you might like to see reflected in policy and practice. And I think a lot of the speakers have kind of alluded to this, but that relationship between matters of fact and matters of concern is a deeply complicated one, and has to do, I think, a lot with storytelling and the way we understand ourselves and our place in the world, and thereby what kudos or what emphasis we give to certain types of evidence. And most of our nature, certainly in the UK, is an emergent feature of a socio-ecological system. So it seems quite strange to me that we have divided social sciences from natural sciences and policy making in exactly the way that we have. So it'd be interesting to hear the panel's views on that.
Thank you. Susan or Andrew, would you like to come back on that particular point?
I spent some time working on death on the road in Parliament, and it was fascinating to find how people perceive the risks as much less than travelling on the train, for example. And after the King's Cross, St Pancras crash, I think it was, Potters Bar, I beg your pardon, get my bit of North London right. I come from the northwest. It was fascinating that the media carried the story about the crash for several days in a row, when on each one of those days more people died on the roads than died at the train crash. Now, you do need behavioural scientists as a policymaker to help you work with the communication issues. When I first joined Parliament, I didn't think that was a good idea. I certainly do now, and Parliament needs that desperately. Government does.
Thank you, Andrew. Susan?
Yeah, make a couple of observations about social sciences. I think whereas very often the natural sciences are seen as, quite correctly seen as, very differentiated. So you might be a geologist or an ecologist or, chemist. Quite often the social sciences are seen as the social sciences. So you'll get, geology, ecology, chemistry, physics, social science. And I think it's a point that Gemma alluded to as well, to see the social sciences themselves as differentiated and able to address different kinds of issues. And I would say also in response to the first question, there are lots of economists in Whitehall, and they are social scientists. What I believe that there still are fewer of are the other kinds of social scientists. And in particular, perhaps, what we sometimes refer to as the critical social sciences, and that maybe there's less of that. In relation to the question, yes, about worldviews and controversies, I think that's absolutely right, and it's why we have to approach the facts, as it were, quite carefully, because almost any major environmental controversy involves very different worldviews, and they're not the same as saying you have, the scientists and the public. These worldviews are shared by a range of different kinds of people on each side, and facts are filtered through people's worldviews. So they tend then to talk. If you think of fracking, that's a very, very interesting example of that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like another question now. So the lady at the back, or yeah.
Thank you. I was going to follow on the social science, natural science element. It's Catherine Monk. I'm the Principal Advisor for Science in Natural Resources Wales. And this has been a long-standing discussion for lots of people for a long time. Overseas, it's certainly in development, we moved along in this discussion for quite considerably, to the extent that the technical solutions were completely sort of sidestepped for very social and behavioural changes, and I think are coming back to a more balanced view. So it's very interesting that in Britain we certainly didn't move as far forward. Part of the problem, I think, is one, certainly in some very hard-pressed government organisations, the social side appears to be easy. It appears to be something that everybody can discuss and make an opinion on. And at a university level, we rarely see the scientific education go into the comparisons of social methodologies, whereas in the social sciences, we have a much better approach of exploring the other alternative methodologies. And I think that is something we could really press forward to get this more integrated approach to solutions.
Thank you. I am going to move to a different subject area, and we've got a question at the back now.
Yes, hello, my name is Amanda Vincent from the University of British Columbia in Canada, where we are delightedly rebuilding our relationship between science and policy. But my actual practical experience in policy is very much in Southeast Asia, implementing UN conventions with national government agencies. And one of the questions I'd like to pose is the degree of separation or intimacy that you found has worked in different contexts between the scientific advisor and the policymaker. So we are directly tasked with working as an advisory capacity to the governments in a formal bilateral relationship, which of course has massive benefits. But the corollary is we don't have the distance that allows us to criticize publicly or goad publicly. And I'd like to get some understanding of what the panel has seen as effective distances between scientists and policymakers for maximum gain and conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Georgina, maybe I could come to you first on that.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting problem, and it depends on the function and the context, as you've described it. I mean, I do think that actually it's less about the degree of close working. It's obviously important that all of this science policy stuff is co-produced, than being very clear what the question is that's being addressed. So working together on a common question, you know, is easier to do. I do think there are some problems with the democratic process if they're too close together, because you just get stuck in a potentially a little cabal around the solution being the thing that has been rehearsed over and over again. Without proper scrutiny from outside. So, yeah, I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's tricky.
And Des?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question, actually, and it's something that certainly I really worry about sometimes. The closer that sort of relationship you have between the, if you like, the politicians, the policy advisors, and the scientists, it can get too cozy. And I think the trick there is to have a very challenging relationship. I mean, I think as ecologists, environmentalists, we give our best advice when we're really challenged and quizzed hard and pushed to provide the evidence and to be this awful term, objective. And that, one thing I have learned there is that the NGOs can play an incredibly important role here in almost mediating between the statutory agency advisors and the politicians, because the NGOs, they've got no baggage, they've got no axe to grind in many ways. And of course, they're there
if
to
only
help.
that were true. Thanks. Gareth, you wanted to come in on this point, I think.
Yeah, Gareth Morgan from the RSPB. Following up that point, there's quite a lot of controversy at the moment, certainly in England, about a so-called anti-advocacy clause that's being built into the relationship with grant aid between government and funders, including academic bodies. I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts about how distinction can be drawn in terms of scientific advice between lobbying, which some might consider unacceptable, and advice to government, which many people regard as absolutely essential and a part of what scientists are funded to do.
Andrew, maybe.
Right, well, just on the previous question, you need to ask yourself the question in British Columbia, do you want independent scientific advisors or do you want civil servants? Actually, you want a mixture, a hybrid of both. You need people that act independently but don't, are trusted sufficiently within the system to enable them to share all the information in a confidential manner. Getting that balance right is a really difficult trick, and that's why I cited the example of Theresa May on CAT. On the question of the advocacy clause, let's be clear, friends, there is nothing wrong with lobbying. We all lobby. The centre of the House of Parliament is called the Central Lobby. The word lobbying came from the physical space, not the other way round. Lobbying is a perfectly honourable thing to do unless you're in somebody's pocket. Scientists are there to lobby on a scientific basis. There is nothing wrong with that. If Parliament doesn't get that right, we will be doing a massive disservice to the work that many of you are doing. So lobby your MP to make sure that he or she doesn't get suckered by what is a badly drafted clause.
Thank you. Does anybody disagree with that or have a slightly different view? As Susan?
I think not different, but perhaps a different illustration. So the body that I've written about, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, managed, I think, to exist for a little over 4 decades by treading an incredibly delicate path between quite a close relationship with the Environment Department in its different guises over 41 years, but also at the same time fiercely demonstrating its independence and quite frequently getting up the nose of the Environment Department. And that was important as well. And I think one senior civil servant once said to me, part of the point would be lost if they appeared to be part of us.
That's right.
And I don't think anyone can pretend that it's clear-cut. And I absolutely agree. There's nothing wrong with lobbying. There is something, it seems to me, fundamentally wrong with presenting something as if it were technical when in fact it is political. And that's a bigger problem in my view.
Thank you. And quickly, Gemma.
Just to draw out that previous point I made about there are hundreds of evidence specialists working as civil servants in Whitehall, and they came from academic departments that many of you are in. So encouraging that two-way exchange between the civil service and academic departments gives greater understanding of what policymakers are trying to do, what academics are trying to achieve, and helps navigate that quite tricky road between the two.
Thank you, and I think we're very encouraged in response to that question. So we have another question in the middle here.
Yes, thank you. It's Sarah Nelson, the Head of International.
I don't think you'll just have to shout with the microphone there too. So it's kind of the other side of the coin from what Gemma was saying. There are many policy people within NGOs and within other organisations that can help the process. So I think I'm looking for another question now. Is there one here? let's have a question from you then.
Robin Buxton, Earth Trust. I wanted to explore what Ian Boyd opened up with values, because I think we've seen the last 50 years in conservation has been very much ridden on the wave that Churchill set going at the end of the war that led to the planning policies, the intrinsic value of nature, of experience of nature, on a very wide and very democratic basis. And my fear is that we've seen the end of that tide. It's ebbed away. And if those values, which I'm sure Ian's right in saying those values are terribly important to our ability then to create influence, how can we turn that round? How can we get the tide to run in our direction again?
Thank you. So about values, Georgina, can I come to you there?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the central problem, I think, for a lot of the conservation end of the debate that we're having here, if that debate is sort of the ecology and environment and you know, the broader set of environmental policy issues. So the conservationist view are essentially a value set. There's a set of outcomes that are perceived to be desirable in the conservation community and that are sometimes called intrinsic values, whether there's a lot of debate about how you use those terms. And that is the bit that we have found it hardest to build into these systematic planning processes for the environment at large, just because it's measured in a different currency than everything else is. The rest of it, pretty much, and Ian Bateman's here, you can turn it into money, or into money saved, or into other things that are foregone to do it. But getting the value of the conservation agenda has been very tricky. And I guess I think this is something we can't sidestep any longer. We've been able to do it in the past, in the sort of last 50 years or so, as you described, when there was not such pressure on resources, on the landscape as there is now. And I don't think we can continue to do it by putting it over in one place as a set of intrinsic values and everything else as something that's valued. And I hope that the great set of people in this building will start to think more creatively about how to tackle that.
Thank you very much. So come on, there's a challenge to you guys. What do you think about the way the values basis for conservation is changing, and are we up for this change? Let's hear some views from around the audience. There's a hand up at the back there.
Thank you. Paul Sinodori from the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority. Just an observation to contribute to the discussion, if there's going to be one. Conservation tends nowadays, or is based upon maintaining plagioclimaxes, which are quite peculiar to the land use that we tend to try and emulate with conservation. And we're all conscious of the rewilding kind of debate that is getting up ahead of steam. And I'm just wondering how the conservation profession is prepared to react to that. I work for a National Park Authority, and my personal view is that as a National Park Authority, it's not for me to actually influence that debate, because I have a function which is laid down by Parliament, and therefore I have to deliver what I'm told to deliver. It's actually for the country to decide what it wants its landscape and its wildlife to do. So I sit there and I wait to see how the country's going to respond.
Yeah, but the country might need some expertise from people like you to help them decide. Can we have a point from here?
Hi, my name is Olga Barbosa. I come from Chile, Universidad Austral de Chile. And I would say, well, in the world that I live, I think it's very different for, you know, if we compare what we have been talking here. And I would say that the problem is that we don't recognize that there are different values. So, for example, I work with agriculture, growers, and they have different values, like, for example, something that the intrinsic value of biodiversity is very important, but others things that, for example, that biodiversity, if it's related to some ecosystem service provision, then that's important. And the thing is that it seems that we're not prepared to you know, like link or accept that variety of values. So I would say that.
Thank you. And while the microphone travels up to the corner there, I'm going to ask Des to just come in on this point.
I'm just not sure that I agree with you, Robin, in posing this question in the first place. I mean, I think we need to remember the building we're in. It's named after David Attenborough, for heaven's sake. He doesn't talk about ecosystem services. He doesn't talk about the ecosystem approach. He talks about nature. He talks about wildlife. And most people get that. If you talk to children, they get the value of nature. If you talk to visitors to national parks, many of them come to national parks to experience wild landscapes and the wildlife that's there. So perhaps we ourselves have got a bit out of tune with this, possibly through perhaps trying to intellectualize the arguments and the framing of the ecosystem approach. We've perhaps lost sight of the fact that nature matters to most people. It has this nourishing, enriching importance, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left only. We're going to run over time, but we'll have 5 minutes. Is this a new question?
It's to react on, follow up the discussion, basically. So it's Guillaume Chaperon from Sweden. I want to react on a previous comment telling that basically it's not up to us, but up to the country to decide how we value nature. And just the lady who said that there are different people who value nature differently. I think our problem, maybe as conservationists, is that we fail to recognize that conservation biology is first an ideology. And if we don't stand really proudly and hardly for our ideology, we are basically unable to win. If you look in the political debate, the Labour Party or the Tory Party does not tell, well, it's not really up to us, we want to know what the other side is thinking. So actually maybe a solution is to not listen to other values, but to push our values as hard as we can so that at the end they win a little bit more.
Thank you. Okay, so I want one last question, a new question for our panel. Down here at the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that working? Yeah. Vicky Morgan from UK EOF, which may be a disappointingly pragmatic question, actually, but I wanted to go back to something Georgina mentioned about the changes in funding for research, particularly from the departments and the research councils and the balance, because it does seem to me that's actually a very big change in the UK and particularly in England. And I wanted to know what the panel think are the implications and how the community, both the policy community and the science community, should be responding.
So this is about the extent to which the funding streams are changing and the impacts on the policy and the scientific community as a result. Georgina first, and then I'll get comments from each of the other panelists as we finish.
Well, I guess I mentioned my concern about this. I think the implications of it is that there is far more funding now on the science supply side and much less opportunity for the demand side or the policy community to engage in that in a kind of equal partnership way. So it could be fine, but we need some new structures and processes in place to make sure that the demand side isn't completely inappropriate for what the supply side isn't inappropriate for what the demand side needs. So I guess I just raised it because I think it's a big change, as you've said, that hasn't had enough attention paid to it.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to come in here?
I think it does tie back, in a sense, to discussion about values. We need to have a better engagement back with those policymakers on how investment in science will, in the long term, produce a better use of public resources. And part of that difficulty is breaking the political process away from the tendency to look at things in 4 and 5 year chunks. And that's why I, again, plead with all scientists, whatever your politics on a personal level, to engage with local representatives, because we've got to get this debate out of the party political into the long-term strategic arena, so that we can start to think about things over programs that might be 10, 15, 20, 30 years long. We don't do that sufficiently.
Gemma?
So more partnership working, and particularly in an interdisciplinary way. I think that's what we've been hearing today. There isn't an environmental question, policy question, that doesn't require environmental science, economic analysis and social science. So we'll see how the Nurse Review gets implemented, but we watch that carefully. Secondly, citizen science becoming much more important in terms of the interface between formal and informal monitoring and surveillance, BTO, ISPB, but many other organisations, hugely helpful. And really thirdly, just reinforcing what Georgina said, there's a lot of evidence out there. We need help in understanding it, synthesising it, digesting it, interpreting it. So really, we need to start there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to finish there, I think. What I'd like to do is thank all of you in the audience for your participation. There's been some good interchange, but most of all, I'd like to thank our panel of Georgina, Des, Gemma, Susan and Andrew, and of course Professor Ian Boyd for setting a really useful context at the beginning of this session. So thank you very much to you all and enjoy your tea break.